So would anyone from last week like to sort of summarize what we did in the first pages of this amazing book? What was Shoghi Effendi talking about? Remember, this is 1941, March of 1941. The Battle of Britain is already well underway. World War II is well underway in both the Pacific and Europe. The United States is actually very involved in the war, but has the bombing of Pearl Harbor won't happen until December. So we're still 6 or about 8 months out before the US fully enters the war, even though Roosevelt actually has the United States on a war footing. And so he is, the Guardian is writing this very compelling letter that goes on for 126 type pages, the original. It's longer than that, even printed as a book, as a letter to the Baha'i world, which makes it different from Advent of Divine Justice, which is just a letter to the North American Baha'i community. And really explaining the times that we're living in and their response to them. And really also explaining many of the tests and difficulties that the faith has endured, because many of the believers who are reading this letter, if they even have access to it, are themselves going through a period of hell. They're in the early periods of that. So this letter, I think, particularly as we see many of the things happening in the world today, takes on even heightened meaning for us, more so than it did even 6 months ago. I think most of the world is shocked at Ukraine and cannot believe that such a military atrocity could happen at this point in history. But the Guardian is taking us all through this. So does anyone have anything from last week that they want to help summarize, or questions, or other things they want to talk about? I'm sorry, Katya is not here because she asked a question and I don't have a firm answer, but I did some digging. You will remember last week, Shoghi Effendi in one passage said that we had to have the most great justice before we would have the most great peace, which would be happen before we had the Baha'i World Commonwealth. So the question was, what is the most great justice? It's a term I had never heard before. So I did a little bit of digging, and if you put that term into Ocean, other than that one particular quote from Shoghi Effendi, you don't find it many other places except in some pilgrim's notes and commentary. And one of the commentaries was a statement from Ali Nachavani, Mr. Nachavani, who many of you remember was on the House of Justice and was quite a Baha'i scholar. He said he thought it was the administrative order. I also put the same question to a friend of mine who is very much a Baha'i scholar. He had never seen it before, but he thought that the Guardian was talking about it as perhaps even being an event. And the way he looked at it was that wonderful statement about the Universal House of Justice being the last refuge of a tottering civilization. And he thought it would be the point in history where finally the governments, peoples of the world, whoever is sort of running things, finally turns to the House of Justice and to Baha'i institutions and says, help, we need your help, we need your guidance, get us out of this mess. And that would be the point of the most great justice. Not necessarily the most great peace, but the most great justice, where the institutions that are a big part of this covenant start wielding the influence that they should be wielding in the world. So anyway, I thought that was as good an explanation as I could certainly come up with. And perhaps some of the rest of you will find something, but it's certainly a phrase that's interesting to contemplate.
Actually, that was my question, and I appreciate
Oh,
it.
it's not us. Okay, so it was your question. That's right. I thought it was Katya's question. Good. So I'm glad you're there. Does that seem like a satisfactory answer?
Yeah, I also did like some search, like keyword search. Just like in two contexts, it came up. One was this book, and then there was another one, but there was no clear explanation. And what you mentioned makes sense. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Well, I can attribute that to someone who's busy working on books on Baha'i theology, but I won't name him. So anyway, so very, very good question. And it was also clear just looking at what was available on the Ocean software that other people have asked, because of studying Promised Day Has Come, have asked as to what that term means. And it's like you said, Sanaz, it doesn't seem that we have an authoritative definition of it. But the Guardian does say it's a prerequisite to the Most Great Peace. All right. Where is Shaheen when we need him? He was here last week. I hope he'll come on tonight. Let's see. So we're now going to try to cover a couple of the next sections, I think 3 sections tonight. As you will recall, the subheadings for this and the other collections of works of the Guardian, for the most part, the subheadings were created by Horace Halley, Hand of the Cause of God, Horace Halley, with the permission of Shoghi Effendi. So I find them very useful. He has already outlined the great suffering of Baha'u'llah and the Bab, and this whole moving drama of the early years of the faith, of the times of the 2 manifestations, of the twin manifestations, and how they were rejected by the people of their time. And he also talks at the very beginning of this book about this unseen calamity that's following us, and that this retribution that for turning against the messengers of God, but also this cleansing that is happening in with mankind through this terrible period that we're in. He lays all of this out very beautifully in the dramatic beginning of this wonderful long short book, or this long letter. And so now tonight we're going to get into the prelude to his discussion about the letters to the kings and rulers. After this book came out, many decades after the book came out, the House of Justice published Summons of the Lord of Hosts, which is the full letters that went to the kings and rulers from Baha'u'llah. In this, he gives, next week, we'll start getting into some of the excerpts that the Guardian gave of those letters and the Guardian's analysis of those letters. But this, what we're going to talk about tonight, is really his prelude to those letters, explaining the context of those letters. So let's see, Sana, can you read this opening paragraph here?
Sure. To enumerate a few of the outstanding features of this moving drama will suffice to evoke in the reader of these pages, already familiar with the history of the faith, the memory of those vicissitudes which it has experienced and which the world has until now viewed with such frigid indifference.
So he's telling us, of course, that he's going to review the history, but then he makes this wonderful commentary at the end, which he said that which the world has, which it has experienced and which the world has until now viewed with such frigid indifference. I just love that adjective, frigid. It's not just indifference, it's this like icy indifference. We don't, that not only are they ignoring it, they don't want to know about it, is sort of what he's saying. So Justin, can you read this, please? I turned this, by the way, into bullet points.
Okay.
Yeah.
The forced and sudden retirement of Baha'u'llah to the mountains of Sulaymaniyah and the distressing consequences that followed from his 2 years complete withdrawal, the incessant
Intrigues.
sorry, what's wrong with me? Intrigues indulged in by the exponents of Shia Islam in Najaf and Karbala, working in close and constant association with their confederates in Persia. The intensification of the repressive measures decreed by Sultan Abdulaziz, which brought to the head of the definition of certain prominent members of the exiled community. The enforcement of yet another banishment by order of that same Sultan, this time to that far off and most desolate of cities, causing such despair as to lead 2 of the exiles to attempt suicide. The unrelaxing surveillance to which they were subjected upon the arrival in Akka by hostile officials and the insufferable imprisonment of 2 years in the barricades of that town. The barracks of that town. The interrogatory to which the Turkish Pasha subsequently subjected his prisoners at the headquarters of the government. His confinement for no less than 8 years in a humble dwelling surrounded by the befolded air of that city, his sole recreation being confined to pacing the narrow space of his room. These, as well as other tribulations, proclaim, on the one hand, the nature of the ordeal and the indignities he suffered, and point, on the other, the finger of accusation at those mighty ones of the earth who had either so sorely maltreated him or deliberately withheld from him their succor.
This is really a very strong bill of complaint against the kings and rulers of the world. Shoghi Effendi is not just listing some of the horrors that Baha'u'llah experienced, he's putting a spin on them. For example, one of the things that jumped out at me was the unrelaxing surveillance to which they were subjected upon their arrival in Akka. Now, I'd never thought about that. When Baha'u'llah was in the Siyah, he didn't have a government official or a prison guard standing there all the time watching everything he was doing and saying. When he's in Sulaymaniyah, of course, he's by himself. In Baghdad, he's living pretty much like a normal person in Baghdad. When he's in exile in Constantinople and Adrianople, he's living like a normal person. He gets to the prison, and not only is he in a prison, he'd been in a prison before, in the Siyah, but he's in a prison where guards are watching him constantly. He can't say or do anything without being under surveillance. And one of the worst depressions of that was he couldn't go to the public bath without being denied even the dignity of washing himself in private. So he refused to go for 3 months. Now, those of you who've ever served in Haifa, you know that when you arrive in Israel at the end of August, you are in the absolute worst of the summer heat. So from that point until about December, in that awful, awful heat, he wasn't able to bathe. I mean, just think about that, because he had to have a government official, whether it's a prison guard or some sort of an official with him constantly. He can't talk to anybody, can't do anything. And so are the people who are his companions. They're under constant surveillance. This is a point I had never thought about. He also, when he talks about how terrible it was to spend those 8 years at the house of house of Aboud in Akka, he brings up how even the air of that city was awful. Now, this is actually a physical fact about Akka. Akka is the Ottoman city that you see when you visit it today, was built on the top of a much older city, including Crusader ruins. And what would happen is rainwater would seep into all those tunnels and crevices in the old city beneath the more contemporary buildings. And in the summer, that putrid water would evaporate and create this putrid vapor over the city that was actually visible from the winter's rains in these places, probably also full of all kinds of garbage and sewage. It would start to, in the summer heat, it would evaporate and create this awful, awful cloud over the city. So this was when they talk about a bird flying over Akka would drop dead of the stench. This wasn't a joke. So this is the kind of place he was sent to. He was sent there because they expected him to die in such circumstances. They wanted him to get sick. It's a lot better than executing him. So this was something that the Guardian pulled out and talked about. We also know that the border of Akka was terrible. But if you look at each one of these lines and how the Guardian pulls out things that we don't normally think about, the fact that the repressive measures of the Sultan were such that it caused some of the members who were with Baha'u'llah's party in Turkey to defect. And of course, part of this is the Azalis. So we're not going to go through each part of this, but I think that it's important as you're reading Shoghi Effendi to pay attention to everything, because he's giving you spin. He's giving you analysis. And he's also pulling out things that make it important, that we might otherwise overlook. So he says something very interesting here at the end. He says, these, as well as other tribulations, proclaim on the one hand the nature of the ordeal and the indignities he suffered, and point on the other the finger of accusation at those mighty ones of the earth who have either so sorely maltreated him or deliberately withheld from him their succor. And now he's going to prove to us why we should accept that last statement, that the kings of the earth, not just the Sultan and not just the Shah, but all the other kings of the earth were responsible for this maltreatment. He's going to prove this to us as we go through. So, Mateen, can you read this page, please?
No wonder that from the pen of him who bore this anguish with such sublime patience, these words should have been revealed. He who is the Lord of the seen and unseen is now manifest unto all men. His blessed self hath been afflicted with such harm that if all the seas, visible and invisible, were turned into ink, and all that dwell in the kingdom into pens, and all that are in the heavens and all that are on the earth into scribes, they would of a certainty be powerless to record it. And again, I have been most of the days of my life, even as a slave, sitting under a sword hanging on a thread, knowing not whether it would fall soon or late upon him. All this generation, he affirms, could offer us were wounds from its darts, and the only cup its proffered to our lips was the cup of its venom. On our neck we still bear the scars of chains, and upon our body are imprinted the evidences of an unyielding cruelty. 20 years have passed, O kings, he addressing the kings of Christendom, at the height of his mission has written, during which we have each day tasted the agony of a fresh tribulation. No one of them that were before us hath endured the things we have endured. Would that ye could perceive it. They that rose up against us have put us to death, have shed our blood, have plundered our property, and violated our honor. Though aware of most of our afflictions, ye nevertheless have failed to stay the hand of the aggressor. For is it not your clear duty to restrain the tyranny of the oppressor, and to deal equitably with your subjects, that your high sense of justice may be fully demonstrated to all mankind?
So what is he saying here at the end to the kings and rulers? And how does this apply also to kings and rulers today?
They shouldn't sit silently. It's their responsibility to stand up for anybody who's oppressing others.
Right. So it didn't matter that Napoleon III didn't rule Palestine. He was put on notice by Baha'u'llah of what was going on. And he had a duty to do something about it. Sarush, can you get this page, please? If you're with us.
I don't know if he's here, or maybe he is. There he is.
Sorry, I'm on the road. I can't really read. I'm very
okay.
sorry.
That's all right. We're just glad you're diligent enough to listen while you're driving. All right, Mateen, can you get this page, please?
Who is the ruler? May it not be confidently asked, whether of the East or of the West, who at any time since the dawn of so transcendent a revelation has been prompted to raise his voice either in its praise or against those who persecuted it? Which people has, in the course of so long a captivity, felt urged to arise and stem the tide of such tribulations? Who is the sovereign accepting a single woman shining in solitary glory, who has, in however small a measure, felt impelled to respond to the poignant call of Baha'u'llah? Who amongst the great ones of the earth was inclined to extend this infant faith of God the benefit of his recognition or support? Which one of the multitudes of creeds, sects, races, parties, and classes, and of the highly diversified schools of human thought, considered it necessary to direct its gaze towards the rising light of the faith, to contemplate its unfolding system, to ponder its hidden processes, to appraise its weighty message, to acknowledge its regenerative power, to embrace its salutary truth, or to proclaim its eternal verities? Who among the worldly wise and the so-called men of insight and wisdom can justly claim, after the lapse of nearly a century, to have disinterestedly approached its theme, to have considered impartially its claims, to have taken sufficient pains to delve into its literature, to have assiduously striven to separate facts from fiction, or to have accorded its cause the treatment it merits? Where are the preeminent exponents, whether of the arts or sciences, with the exception of a few isolated cases, who have lifted a finger or whispered a word of what is it?
Commendation.
Commendation, in either the defense or the praise of a faith that has conferred upon the world so priceless a benefit, that has suffered so long and so grievously, and which enshrines within its shell so enthralling a promise for a world so woefully battered, so manifestly bankrupt. Ooh.
So what do you think about this paragraph? Anything jump out at you? Any thoughts? So who is the sovereign excepting a single woman shining out in solitary glory who has impelled to respond? Who is the single woman that responded of all the sovereigns?
Queen of England.
Right, Queen Victoria. So I want to point something out here. It says, who among the worldly wise and so-called men of insight and wisdom can justly claim, after the lapse of nearly a century, to have disinterestedly approached its theme, to have considered impartially its claims, to have taken sufficient pains to delve into its literature, to have assiduously striven to separate facts from fiction, or to have accorded its cause the treatment it merits? Professor Brown, who we extol, when he gets back to Cambridge University, and starts writing about the Babis and his encounter with Baha'u'llah, he's basically told by his superiors at Cambridge University, don't bother with that. That's not going to get you anywhere. This is an obscure sect and nobody's interested. He was pressured to minimize the number of publications he wrote on the Baha'i faith and the Babis. Even today, how many of the religion departments in the world treat the Baha'i faith seriously? The philosophy departments. When leaders in the world or thinkers in the world are looking for insights into particular issues, do they turn to Baha'u'llah's writings? Do they even know Baha'u'llah exists? It's getting better. It's certainly not what it was when this was written in 1941. But where are the preeminent exponents, whether the arts or science, who have lifted a finger or whispered a word of commendation in defense or praise of the faith? You know, this is the work we have cut out for ourselves. We know how great this revelation is. The rest of the world has allowed it to stay in obscurity. And not from lack of attempts to get them to pay attention to it. I'm going to just summarize this slide so that we don't get too bogged down, but he also goes on to talk about how not only did the Bab and Baha'u'llah suffer, but the sufferings of Abdul-Baha and his pleas and entreaties during the last years of his life, when he tried to warn the world of what was coming. And then he gives us a very concise summary of all the things that Abdul-Baha witnessed, experienced in his life. And then says, he too, the center and pivot of Baha'u'llah's peerless covenant and the perfect exemplar of his teachings, was made to taste at the hands of potentates, ecclesiastics, governments, and peoples, the cup of woe which the Bab and Baha'u'llah, as well as so many of their followers, had drained. So he wasn't spared either. He wasn't tortured and so forth like the Bab and Baha'u'llah were, but he certainly was imprisoned and threatened with being executed and so forth. So he faced much the same persecution that the two manifestations did. Shaheen, welcome.
Thank you.
Sanaz, can you read this, please?
Sure. With the warnings which both his pen and voice have given in countless tablets and discourses during an almost lifelong incarceration and in the course of his extended travels in both the European and American continents, they who labor for the spread of his father's faith in the Western world are sufficiently acquainted. How often and how passionately did he appeal to those in authority and to the public at large to examine dispassionately the precepts enunciated by his father. With what precision and emphasis he unfolded the system of the faith he was expounding, elucidated its fundamental verities, stressed its distinguishing features, and proclaimed the redemptive character of its principles. How intensely did he foreshadow the impending chaos, the approaching upheavals, the universal conflagration, which in the concluding years of his life had only begun to reveal the measure of its force and the significance of its impact on human society.
To me, the Guardian is saying the Bab and Baha'u'llah suffered, and they put forth the revelation of God and tried to get the attention of the clergy and of the rulers. And Abdu'l-Baha continued that process. So if they didn't get it from the twin manifestations, Abdu'l-Baha took the same message to them. How insistently did he foreshadow the impending chaos? And then the concluding years of his life, of course, was World War I. Those concluding years began to reveal the measure of this, its force and the significance of its impact on human society. Let's see, Mateen, can you get this, please?
A co-sharer in the woeful trials and momentary frustrations afflicting the Bab and Baha'u'llah, reaping a harvest in his lifetime, wholly incommensurate. Oh, wow, that's a tough word. What is it?
Incommensurate, you're right.
Okay, nice. Incommensurate to the sublime, the incessant, the strenuous efforts he had exerted, experiencing the initial perturbations of the world-shaking catastrophe in store for an unbelieving humanity bent with age and with eyes dimmed by the gathering storm which the reception accorded by a faithless generation to his father's cause was raising. And with a heart bleeding over the immediate destiny of God's wayward children, he at last sank beneath a weight of troubles for which who had imposed them upon him, and upon those gone before him were soon to be summoned to a dire reckoning.
When we think about the last years of Abdu'l-Baha's life and his passing, would we sum it up like this paragraph? This paragraph's a real downer, isn't it? You know?
I would say yes.
Yeah. So Shaheen, glad you're here. Tell us what you think about this paragraph.
Well, I mean, he had the weight of, he had to deal with covenant breakers in addition to, since the time of the passing of his father, the covenant breakers immediately stood up
Right.
to cause mischief and the government of and then they were telling the Ottoman Empire that Abdu'l-Baha is building a fortress, whatnot. He had the responsibility of creating the shrine of the Bab for the remains of the Bab, and bringing it securely from Iran to Akka. He had to oversee the formation of assemblies all across the world. Just keep constantly writing letters. Everything was on top of his head.
And here he is. He has done his absolute best, reaping a harvest in his lifetime wholly incommensurate to the sublime, the insistent and strenuous efforts he had exerted. So he puts his whole heart, his whole being, his whole life, risk his life to spread Baha'u'llah and the message of the Bab and Baha'u'llah. And he didn't see the tangible fruits for the most part. I mean, think of the thousands and thousands of people he met in the West, of all the press coverage he got, of all the public officials. Now, yes, there were people we know of who were very much affected by their encounter with him, but they were a tiny drop. A tiny drop. Incommensurate, which means not equal to the amount of effort he did, was his harvest. The reception accorded by a faithless generation to his father's cause, with a heart bleeding over the immediate destiny of God's wayward children. This isn't just the Baha'is, this is humanity, God's wayward children. He at last sank beneath a weight of troubles, for which they who had imposed them upon him and upon those gone before him were soon to be summoned to a dire reckoning. And the Primus Day is speaking of this reckoning, turning away from the manifestations and then turning away and imposing hardships on Abdu'l-Baha. Mankind is being summoned to a reckoning for this. Pretty weighty paragraph, right? And to let us know that this isn't just his own opinion about his grandfather's point of view. He's quoting his grandfather here. Let's see. Justin, can you read this, please?
Sure. Hasten, oh my God, he cried, at a time when adversity had sore beset him, the days of my ascension unto thee, and of my coming before thee, and of my entry unto thy presence, that I may be delivered from the darkness of the cruelty inflicted by them upon me, and may enter the luminous atmosphere of thy nearness. O my Lord, the all-glorious, and may rest under the shadow of thy most great mercy. Ya Baha'u'llah. He wrote in a tablet revealed during the last week of his life, I have renounced the world and the people thereof, and am heartbroken and sorely afflicted because of the unfaithful. In the cage of this world I flutter, even as a frightened bird, and yearn every day to take my flight unto thy kingdom. Ya Baha'u'llah, make me to drink of the cup of sacrifice and set me free. Relieve me from these woes and trials, from these afflictions and troubles.
By the way, his last letter to the American believers was warning them about covenant breaking. Dear friends, this is the Guardian addressing us. Alas, 1,000 times alas, that a revelation so incomparably great, so infinitely precious, so mightily potent, so manifestly innocent, should have received at the hands of a generation so blind and so perverse, so infamous a treatment. O my servants, Baha'u'llah himself testifies, the one true God is my witness. This most great, this fathomless and surging ocean is near, astonishingly near unto you. Behold, it is closer to you than your life vein. Swift as the twinkling of an eye, ye can, if ye but wish it, reach and partake of this imperishable favor, this God-given grace, this incorruptible gift, this most potent and unspeakably glorious bounty. I mean, this is tragic what he's saying to us. He's saying, look what we have. It's so close. I'm trying to get you there. I'm trying to get you to this great surging ocean of God. And yet, what have you done? I hand you a gift and you throw it back. The next section, a world receded from him. And this is very interesting. What he's going to do, excuse me. Okay. He's going to alternate. I have created the bullet points. This is still the text as it is, but I set it out as bullet points. You'll see he addresses, he talks about the world, then the faith, the world, the faith, the world, the faith. He'll do that for about 6 or 7 lines. So let's see. Shaheen, are you in a good place to read?
Yeah, I can read. I'll try it right now.
Okay, if you could do that, that would be great. I'm going to get you to actually do 2 slides because he keeps on going world, faith, world, faith. Okay.
Sure. After a revolution of well nigh 100 years, what is it that the eye encounters as one surveys the international scene and looks back upon the early beginnings of Baha'i history? Is it Baha'i? Because some of this is blocked out on my Zoom
Yes,
thing.
yeah, sorry.
The Baha'i history. A world convulsed by the agonies of contending systems, races, and nations, entangled in the mesh of its accumulated falsities, receding farther and farther from him who is the sole author of its destinies, and sinking deeper and deeper into a suicidal carnage, which its neglect and persecution of him who is its redeemer have precipitated. A faith still proscribed, yet bursting through its chrysalis, emerging from the obscurity of a century-old.
Whoops. Shaheen, we missed you. Shaheen, you dropped out there for a minute.
You're on mute, Shaheen.
Can you start
A
again?
faith still proscribed.
Yeah.
Yeah, at the faith, right?
Yeah,
A faith still proscribed, yet bursting through its chrysalis, emerging from the obscurity of a century-old repression, face to face with the awful evidences of God, and destined to raise above the ruins of a smitten civilization. A world spiritually destitute, morally bankrupt, politically disrupted, socially convulsed, economically paralyzed, writhing, bleeding, and breaking up beneath the avenging rod of God. A faith whose call remained unanswered, whose claims were rejected, whose warnings were brushed aside, whose followers were mowed down, whose aims and purposes were maligned, whose summons to the rulers of the earth were ignored, whose herald drained the cup of martyrdom, over the head of whose author swept a sea of unheard of
Tribulations.
stable connection where I am.
Yeah, Shaheen, you're coming and going.
Yeah, I don't think I have a stable connection where I am. I'm in a car.
Oh, okay.
Of unheard of tribulations, and whose exemplar sank beneath the weight of lifelong sorrows and dire misfortunes.
Okay, that's good. But we'll stop there for a second. Actually, I'll go and read this next page. A world that has lost its bearings, in which the bright flame of religion is fast dying out, in which the forces of a blatant nationalism and racialism have usurped the rights and prerogatives of God himself, in which a flagrant secularism, the direct offspring of irreligion, has raised its triumphant head and is protruding its ugly features, in which the majesty of kingship has been disgraced, and they who wore its emblems have for the most part been hurled from their thrones, in which the once all-powerful ecclesiastical hierarchies of Islam, and to a lesser extent those of Christianity, have been discredited, and in which the virus of prejudice and corruption is eating into the vitals of an already gravely disordered society. A faith whose institutions, the pattern and crowning glory of the age which is to come, have been ignored and in some instances trampled upon and uprooted, whose unfolding system has been derided and partly suppressed and crippled, whose rising order, the sole refuge of a civilization and the embrace of doom, has been spurned and challenged, whose mother temple has been seized and misappropriated, and whose house, the cynosure of an adoring world, has, through a gross miscarriage of justice, as witnessed by the world's highest tribunal, been delivered into the hands and violated by its implacable enemies. So of course, there toward the end, he's talking about the house of worship in Ishkabad, the house of Baha'u'llah in Baghdad, and which despite going to the World Court, where it was ordered that we were the rightful owners, was still given to the clergy of Iraq. Whoops, let me go backwards. Let's see. Let's see. Sorry. So any immediate thoughts? I mean, this is really dense. Shoghi Effendi throws so much at us in these each one of these sentences. And remember, this is 1941. Any thoughts or anything that jumped out at you? Any questions?
I had one question about the next slide.
Okay.
On the first paragraph is talking about nationalism, racialism, secularism, and then he also talks about the disgrace of majesty of kingship. So I was wondering why he talked about this here, why it was necessary for him to mention it here.
Well, I think that he's talking about, I mean, this is also coming right within a year or two after the King of England resigned, abdicated, because he wanted to marry the woman he loved, you know, the Wallace and Simpson, the American. And it was really part of, he was King Edward. And then he becomes the Duke of Windsor, but he he was a disgraceful playboy, and you know, it was that and other the way that royalty was acting. Royalty's never paragons of virtue, let's face it, you know, but the remaining royal families of the world were being looked upon by the people of the world for who they were. They no
Mhm.
longer had the aura of majesty about them. They were front page news of the world's newspapers. And the British royal family got it the worst, but that was true of most of the royal households of the world. That and increasingly, this would also be true of any head of state, whether you're a president or whether you're a king or queen. And so the majesty of kingship has been disgraced. We don't even hold these people, we don't admire them, we don't even show respect to them anymore. And the press and the way the world has evolved, they've lost any aura that used to be around them. And he goes on to say it's not just kingship. I mean, many dynasties fell because of World War One. I mean, the Habsburg dynasty, which had been going on for 1,000 years, the dynasty of the Tsar of Russia. You just go down the list. The Emperor of China, all of that was gone in a very short period of time in the years immediately following World War One. The Kaiser in Germany, so and the Sultan and the Shah. The Shah had been overthrown in Iran. So you just go through all of these, what seemed impregnable royal households, and they were gone. But then he says the ecclesiastical hierarchies are also being discredited. I mean, one of the things it says, and to a lesser extent, those of Christianity. Now, this paragraph, he's going to talk about in detail later in this book. He's going to go through Shia Islam and all the things that have happened and Sunni and Christianity, and also what's happened with all the kings and rulers. So he's laying out these things, but he's giving us a big picture right now. And it's also very interesting that as he juxtaposes that with the next paragraph about us, a faith whose institutions, the pattern and crowning glory of the age which is to come. And nonetheless, we have been trampled upon. Let's see, somehow we didn't go back. He also says here, that our faith is destined to arise above the ruins of a smitten civilization, which I think we have to often go back and remember that no matter how awful the world situation is, the faith is going to rise above it. This is pretty weighty stuff here. Any other thoughts? Watching the clock, so I'd like to move on. Mateen, can you read this, please?
We are indeed living in an age which, if we would correctly appraise it, should be regarded as one which is witnessing a dual phenomenon. The first signalizes the death pangs of an order, effete and godless, that has stubbornly refused, despite the signs and portents of a century-old revelation, to attune its processes to the precepts and ideals which that heaven-sent faith proffered. The second proclaims the birth pangs of an order divine and redemptive that will inevitably supplant the former, and within whose administrative structure and embryonic civilization, incomparable and world-embracing, is imperceptibly maturing. The one is being rolled up and is crashing its oppression, bloodshed, and ruin. The other opens up vistas of a justice, a unity, a peace, a culture such as no age has ever seen. The former has spent its force, demonstrated its falsity and barrenness, lost irretrievably its opportunity, and is hurrying to its doom. The latter,
Virile.
virile and unconquerable, is plucking asunder its chains and is vindicating its title to be the one refuge within which a sore tried humanity, purged from its dross, can attain its destiny.
Any thoughts about this? So when the House of Justice tells us, for example, in its letters about the most challenging issue about the black-white situation in the United States, that the best way to solve that problem is the core activities framework for action, it's because the Guardian made it very clear. We are the one refuge within which a sore-tried humanity purged from its dross can attain its destiny. So all these other organizations and marching and this, that, and the other, that's not going to fix it. Not going to fix the problems. We are going to supplant the world we see today and give a new world. And their administrative structure is the embryonic civilization. So if you want justice, unity, peace, and a culture such as no age has ever seen, we have to put the Baha'i teachings, the Baha'i faith into place. And we're wasting our time if we spend our time with the old world order. Soon Baha'u'llah himself has prophesied, will the present day order be rolled up and a new one spread out in its stead? And again, by myself, the day is approaching when we will have rolled up the world and all that is therein and spread out a new order in its stead. The day is approaching when God will have raised up a people who will call to remembrance our days, who will tell the tale of our trials, who will demand the restitution of our rights from them who without a title of evidence have treated us with manifest injustice. Are each of you part of those people God has raised up who will call out to remembrance our days, tell the tale of our trials, demand the restitution of our rights?
I still think that's several generations away.
I think you're part of it already. All of us are part of it.
It's several generations. Sure, but I don't think that if anything that I say, oh, I demand, what is it called, restitution, or that.
Right, demand the restitution of our
I don't
rights.
expect any. I don't think anybody should.
Well, we are doing that. When we call our congressman on behalf of the bills that the National Assembly is putting forward for the Baha'is in Iran, for example, we are demanding the restitution of our rights. You know, we're being called upon to do that. So there's just not enough of us, right? Dear friends, the trials which have afflicted the faith of Baha'u'llah, a responsibility for the trials which have afflicted the faith of Baha'u'llah, a responsibility appalling and inescapable rest upon those into whose hands the reins of civil and ecclesiastical authority were delivered. The kings of the earth and the world's religious leaders alike must primarily bear the brunt of such an awful responsibility. Everyone well knoweth, Baha'u'llah himself testifies, that all the kings have turned aside from him and all the religions have opposed him. From time immemorial, he declares, they who have been outwardly invested with authority have debarred men from setting their faces toward God, They have disliked that men should gather together around the most great ocean, inasmuch as they have regarded and still regard such a gathering as the cause of and the motive for the disruption of their sovereignty. The kings, he moreover has written, have recognized that it was not in their interest to acknowledge me, as have likewise the ministers and the divines, notwithstanding that my purpose hath been most explicitly revealed in the divine books and tablets, and the true one hath loudly proclaimed that this most great revelation hath appeared for the betterment of the world and the exaltation of the nations. And then the Bob basically goes on to say pretty much the same thing. I'm going to move on to this section where he talks about, he gives, as part of this prologue, he talks about the people that Baha'u'llah sent his message to. Let's see. Mateen, can you read this, please?
I feel like it's like a test. It's like every time you read something, the vocabulary becomes a little harder, a little harder. It's like, oh, that was too easy for you? Okay, well, here you go.
Right.
It should not be forgotten that it was the kings of the earth and the world's religious leaders who, above all other categories of men, were made. Oh,
Sorry, I was trying to get rid of something and it didn't. Go ahead. Sorry. Go
were
ahead.
made the direct recipients of the message proclaimed by both the Bab and Baha'u'llah. It was they who deliberately addressed in numerous and historic tablets, who were summoned to respond to the call of God, and to whom were directed in clear and forcible language the appeals, the admonitions, and warnings of his persecuted messengers. It was they who, when the faith was born and later when its missions were proclaimed, were still for the most part wielding unquestioned and absolute civil and celestial authority over their subjects and followers. It was they who, whether glorying in the pomp and pageantry of kingship, as yet scarcely restricted by constitutional limitations, or entrenched within the strongholds of a seemingly inviolable celestial power, assumed ultimate responsibility for any wrongs inflicted by those whose immediate destinies they controlled. It would be no exaggeration to say that in most of the countries of the European and Asiatic continents, absolutism on the one hand has and complete
Subservience.
subservience to celestial hierarchies on the other were still the outstanding features of the political and religious life of the masses. These dominated and shackled were robbed of the necessary freedom that would enable them to either appraise the claims and merits of the message offered to them, or to embrace unreservingly its truth.
This is a very important paragraph. To me, it's one of the most important paragraphs in the whole dispensation of Baha'u'llah. Why would I say that? What is he saying here? So let me see if I can unpack this for you. Of course, he starts writing his letters to the kings and rulers in Adrianople, and he finishes it in the prison in Akka. And in the mid-19th century, the Guardian is reminding us that at that time, the average person had no ability to make their own decision about religious truth. They were told by the government and by the religious authorities of wherever it was they were living what they had to believe. There was no way that Baha'u'llah could get his message to the peoples of the earth without going through the kings and rulers of the earth and the religious hierarchies of his day. It was essential. If you look back at Muhammad, we know that Muhammad did write to a couple of kings or rulers in his area, but he didn't address the overall kings and rulers of the earth. He didn't have to. In the desert, you could kind of believe what you wanted to believe, right? But he says, these, we're talking about the average citizen here in this last sentence, these dominated and shackled were robbed of the necessary freedom that would enable them to either appraise the claims and merits of the message proffered to them or to embrace unreservedly its truth. How many countries in the world today, if you change your religion, you are subject to a death sentence? You're born a Muslim, you have to stay a Muslim. It's apostasy. That's what that word means, to give up your faith is apostasy. So without that freedom, to the United States at the time of Baha'u'llah was probably the only country in the planet where you could believe anything you wanted religiously, which is one of the reasons I think that we're the cradle of the Baha'i administrative order.
What about Great Britain at the time?
The Church of England still ran Great Britain.
But does that mean that you had to be Christian in England, or?
There were a lot of, you could not have been Jewish, Muslim, or whatever and been able to hold public office. There were oaths you had to take that had to do with Christianity in order to hold public office, and many other aspects of it. You know, the Church of England was getting some of it, much of its income was coming from taxes that were imposed on people. So you had more freedom than you did in some other countries. And certainly England, if you read the history of the previous 400 years, it was one constant fight over theology that caused, as we talked last week, the fires of Smithfield, where people were being burned at the stake, depending on whether the Protestants or Catholics were in control of the country as to who was being burned. But England still had, by the mid-19th century, there was more freedom, but it was still, and still to today, has a state religion.
I see, thank you.
Yeah. The United States was the only country in the world that did not have a state religion. So Baha'u'llah had to address these, and that also meant that they then, the kings and rulers who were addressed, then had spiritual consequences. They were held responsible for how they responded. It said very few of them were, it was they were yet scarcely restricted by constitutional limitations. That's a 20th century thing. And there were still entrenched strongholds of invaluable ecclesiastical power. Small wonder then that the author of the Baha'i faith, and to a lesser degree its herald, should have directed at the world's supreme rulers and religious leaders the full force of their messages and made them the recipients of some of their most sublime tablets, and invited them in a language at once clear and insistent to heed their call. Small wonder that they should have taken the pains to unroll before their eyes the truths of their respective revelations, and should have expiated on their woes and suffering. Small wonder that they should have stressed the preciousness of the opportunities which it was in the power of these rulers and leaders to seize, and should have warned them in ominous tones of the grave responsibilities which the rejection of God's message would entail, and should have predicted when rebuffed and refused the dire consequences which such a rejection involved. Small wonder that he who is the King of Kings and Vice Regent of God himself should, when abandoned, contemned, and persecuted, have uttered this epigrammatic and momentous prophecy. From two ranks amongst men have the power hath been seized, kings and ecclesiastics. And he's going to spend most of the rest of this great work providing proof. From two ranks amongst men, power hath been seized, kings and ecclesiastics. So, Justin, can you read this, please?
Sure. As to the kings and emperors, who did not only symbolize in their persons the majesty of earthly dominion, but who, for the most part, actually held unchallengeable sway over the multitudes of their subjects. Their relation to the faith of Baha'u'llah constitutes one of the most illuminating episodes in the history of the heroic and formative age of that faith. The divine summons, which embraced within its scope so large a number of the crowned heads of both Europe and Asia, the theme and language of the messages that brought them into direct contact with the source of God's revelation, the nature of their reaction to so stupendous an impact, and the consequences which ensued and can still be witnessed today are the salient features of a subject upon which I can but inadequately touch, and which will be fully and befittingly treated by future Baha'i historians.
God doesn't mess around. Sanaz, can you read this, please?
The Emperor of the French, the most powerful ruler of this day on the European continent, Napoleon III, Pope Pius, is it the fifth?
Ninth.
The supreme head of the highest church in Christendom, and the wielder of the scepter of both temporal and spiritual authority, the omnipotent Caesar of the vast Russian Empire, Alexander II, the renowned Queen Victoria, whose sovereignty extended over the greatest political combination the world has witnessed, William I, the conqueror of Napoleon III, King of Prussia and the newly acclaimed monarch of a unified Germany, Francis Joseph, the autocratic King Emperor of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, the heir of the far-famed Holy Roman Empire, the tyrannical Abdulaziz, the embodiment of the concentrated power vested in the Sultanate and the Caliphate, the notorious Nasser-ad-Din Shah, the despotic ruler of Persia, and the mightiest potentate of Shia Islam. In a word, most of the preeminent embodiments of power and of sovereignty in his day became, one by one, the object of Baha'u'llah's special attention, and were made to sustain in varying degrees the weight of the force communicated by his appeals and warnings.
It's interesting, he reminds us of Queen Victoria, her sovereignty extended over the greatest political combination the world has witnessed. At that time, as they like to say, the sun never sets on the British Empire. You know, there was 1/4 of the world's population, just under that one ruler. So this is where we're going to stop for today. And next week we will get into the actual tablets. Did anyone have any thoughts, questions from what we've covered this evening?
Not in particular, but I do thank you for this. It's a nice refresher to kind of look back at these things.